From A&E, this is Biography.
He starred as Little Joe and in Little House on the Prairie, but there was nothing small about Michael Landon's talent and ambition. He created programs about ideal families while promoting himself as a perfect father and husband. In fact, the reality didn't quite match the image. Landon was raised in a family perfect only in misery. He was a boy caught between two feuding parents and two religions. But Michael grew into a gifted actor and writer, often creating stories that centered on the unconditional love he sought. He touched a chord with television audiences and spent 3 decades as an admired symbol of family values. Landon once said that if you can give the audience a good cry, they'll keep coming back. He did, and they did too.
Gee, I was a skinny kid, wasn't I?
We have welcomed Michael Landon into our home so many times over the years that by now we feel we know him. But of course, we've only just glimpsed the outline of the man.
He's a kind of a critter that doesn't really exist anymore. He took responsibility for his show.
He had the most infectious and just a silly, almost boyish kind of giggle.
He was a big kid, yeah.
He lived a life of love and laughter with a generous dose of the kind of emotional complications that come from having 3 marriages. The drive that turned him into a television icon is the stuff of motivational textbooks.
I still am amazed by the number of people that I meet who will talk about sitting down in front of a Little House episode and crying.
He has continued to face this battle with humor and honesty and a personal sense of dignity that characterizes the man. Would you welcome Michael Landon?
A critic once noted that everything Michael Landon touched turned to apple pie. But in reality, his life was not completely above reproach, and the first person to tell you that would be Michael Landon.
I'm far from being a saint or a squeaky clean kind of a guy. I'm really just your average family man. The only difference is I'm on TV a lot. But aside from that, I'm like anybody else here. Except for when I walk on water. Just a nasty habit.
Michael Landon began his life as Eugene Maurice Orowitz, born October 31st, 1936 in Forest Hills, New York. His sister Evelyn was already 3.5 years old. The children had show business in their blood. Peggy O'Neill was an outgoing young beauty who found an outlet for her flamboyant personality dancing in a Broadway chorus line. Peggy met a studio executive named Eli Orowitz, in charge of East Coast publicity for RKO Pictures. Though Peggy was from an Irish Catholic family and Eli was a Jew, the couple married anyway. They grew to hate each other and turned Landon's childhood into a holy war.
His childhood was a difficult one. He had parents who fought constantly, and when they didn't fight, they didn't speak. They didn't speak for months.
6, 7 weeks would go by, One sitting here, I'm sitting here, mother's there, and tell your father dinner's ready, Dinner's ready.
By the early 1940s, Eli's once promising career at RKO Pictures had stalled. With a family of 4 to feed, Eli had to be practical. He swallowed his pride and took a job managing a string of movie theaters in New Jersey. The Orowitz family moved to a brand new home in the blue-collar community of Collingswood, New Jersey. Eli started spending long hours at the movie theater, which meant he wasn't around to protect the children from their mother's increasingly erratic behavior.
I know that they were hit a lot from my grandmother. She would go off on these rages, and she would grab Michael by his ears and swing him around, and she would say, "Let's dance around the room."
Peggy Orowitz was prone to depression and half-hearted suicide attempts. she seemed to take out most of her personal frustrations on the children.
And one of the saddest things Dad told me was when he was just a little boy, I believe he had turned 6, and his mother said, "You know, I don't like little boys. You're not cute anymore."
He once told me he used to run out of the house. He had a hiding place, and he used to pretend to be other people. And he used to play different roles and just take on a whole different life by pretending.
The future star began dreaming about a perfect family in order to escape his own family's more depressing reality. He later blamed himself for talking his parents into staying together.
My mother and father just flat out didn't like each other. And it was partially my fault that they ever stayed together. I was always the one to beg, "Please don't leave." Well, unfortunately, they were listening to a 7-year-old.
Eugene wet his bed until he was a teenager, and his angry mother tried to humiliate him into stopping by hanging the soiled sheets outside his bedroom window. Even so, he never confided to friends about his miserable home life.
In those days, if we had problems, we pretty much kept them to ourselves. It's not like today where everybody knows everybody's business, you know, and those days kids didn't say much about what was going on in their homes.
At Collingswood High in the early 50s, Eugene Orowitz was just another scrawny teenager with a funny-sounding nickname.
Well, I knew him as Oogie Orowitz. Oogie was what we called him. It was Eugene, but we all called him Oogie.
He felt tormented at home, but Oogie put up a funny facade in public.
We had a teacher, Mrs. Snoke, who was the type of teacher you didn't say boo and everybody was scared to death, but all of a sudden after 5 minutes she'd say, "Eugene, did you do your homework from last night?" And he would laugh and say no. And she would lose control of the class, and that upset her greatly.
I remember he used to sit next to me in Spanish class and rarely got very good scores, but somehow or other always passed the course. I think the teachers just loved him because he had so much charm and such a lovable way about him.
Oogie Orowitz was turning out to be a likable underachiever. He was too small to play football or basketball, but he was fast enough to make the track team. That's when he discovered the javelin.
He was 135 pounds soaking wet, about 5'7", 5'8", but he just had a real live arm and a lot of whip in his arm, where fellas much bigger than him just didn't have that whip.
For the first time, Oogie had found something he was really good at, and he finally buckled down. He practiced the javelin 6 days a week.
He would take his javelin home with him or walk to school with it, and I mean, I'd seen him more than once. He'd take the javelin and walk to school and just throw it, walk up, pick it up, just like you would a golf ball. Throw it and go pick it up and get the golf ball.
He would throw the javelin 200 feet, and then my little 115-pound body would get the javelin, run back 100 feet with it, and then throw it the other 100 feet so he could keep practicing.
And he just worked and worked and worked so hard. I mean, it was amazing to see this little scrawny, skinny kid just build himself up tremendously. And I remember seeing him doing one-arm push-ups with his left arm because he was lefty. And he just became tremendously strong.
Somewhere around this time, the teenage Landon saw the 1949 movie Samson and Delilah with Victor Mature and Hedy Lamarr.
Samson killed a lion with his bare hands.
The once scrawny, now strong teenage boy was overwhelmed by the larger-than-life image he saw on the screen.
Samson, this is the mark of your power. It's your hair.
In his own mind, the teenager identified with the long-haired hero Samson. Landon's own hair had always been dark, thick, and curly. Now, he started to believe that his hair might actually be a source of superhuman strength.
I've taken away your strength, Samson.
That fantasy was custom-made for a teenage misfit trying to comprehend his newfound ability. Not surprisingly, Oogie never told the guys about his harebrained theory. He just kept showing off.
He had a white picket fence around his house. And he took his javelin and threw his javelin and knocked every one of those pickets off the fence. He would just stand up on the lawn and throw the javelin and knock a picket out and then pick it up and knock another picket out. So then he said, okay, now go get the hammers. We got to put it all up before my father comes home, before he gets all upset about it.
Eli spent most of his time at work. When he was at home, his unhappy marriage made him distant and remote. Eugene began looking around for substitute father figures. Friends say he became close to their high school janitor, whom he often went to for advice. He dated occasionally, but never seemed to take high school life that seriously.
Our senior year, he was running for a class office, and he was giving his speech. And I remember he said, friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your homework.
Scholastically, Oogie Orowitz was in fierce competition for last place. He finished 199th out of a class of 201. The only saving grace was that he won first place in javelin at the state championship, which earned him an athletic scholarship to USC. Even his own friends never expected Oogie to amount to much.
When Michael was in high school, he was never dedicated to anything but throwing the javelin. So then to see him on these TV shows, you could never imagine that he had that inside him, because all through high school, he never showed any of that talent.
Landon discovered that talent only by accident, and only because he had hardened himself enough to find victory in the jaws of defeat. In the fall of 1954, 17-year-old Michael Landon, still known by his real name, Eugene Orowitz, moved to California with dreams of Olympic glory.
When I came to California, I was on a scholarship at USC for throwing the javelin, and I figured I'd throw the javelin in college 4 years, and then I'd go in the service, and hopefully I'd get in the Olympics, and then I'd decide after 8 years what I was going to do.
All of that changed when a torn shoulder ligament ended his javelin career. His dreams shattered, Eugene left college within the year. He took various blue-collar jobs, but money was so tight he could barely eat.
I was process surfing at the time and selling blankets door to door. I used to cry and tell them that my father had had a heart attack and was losing the store, and I had to try to dispose of these blankets to pay his hospital bills. And women would generally want to give me a cup of tea and ask me to sit down and take it easy.
Landon had always craved the closeness of family. Through a friend, he met and married a legal secretary named Dodie Frazier. Dodie was 7 years older than her husband and had a 6-year-old son named Mark, whom Landon adopted.
He had like a skinny, lean, but heroic way about him. You know, dark curly hair. And I said, hey, what's your name? And he goes, Gene. I said, well, I'm Mark. And we just hit it off.
A few years later, the family adopted a second son named Josh. Michael told the children the fishiest stories he could imagine.
I used to wear big blue sweatshirts under my regular shirt. My oldest son was convinced I was Superman, because I let him get a pop look at that one day. And I told him, now look, I want you to know something. It's between you and I. I am Clark Kent. I'm Superman. He was 7 years old. What? I said, if you tell anybody, I can't fight crime. Well, of course, he went out and told every kid in the neighborhood. And let me give you the topper. I went upstairs, and my kid's down in the den looking at a book. And I went to hook the screen, and I leaned forward and fell out the window. Right? In my jockey shorts. I fell out the window and landed on the patio. But I went by the window he was sitting at. And I got up. I mean, as luck would have it, I was a little sore, but I wasn't hurt. And I walked back I opened the door, walked back in the house, and he's standing in the hall like that. He said, what did you just do? I said, I flew down to see if the paper was here, and I went upstairs. When he was 22 years old, I finally had to tell him the truth.
Throughout his own unhappy childhood, Landon managed to put up a brave front. Now that hard-earned inner strength was about to come in handy. After following a friend to a studio audition, he set his sights on acting, and he managed to tough it out through rounds of humiliating rejections.
It's telephone time.
Telephone Time, in 1956, was his first big break.
Little person. So little.
That is a child.
Child?
We were all little children once, like her.
Not Casper.
Yes.
By now, the young actor had already discarded his ethnic-sounding real name of Eugene Orowitz and invented something with more star power.
everybody had an actor's name in the early 50s, you know. You had Rock and Lance and all these people, you know. There's Rock, there's Lance, and Eugene. No, it just didn't seem to work out for me.
His new last name came out of a phone book.
And so we said it a couple times, Michael Landon. Yeah. And it clicked.
The newly minted Michael Landon showed surprising diversity in his early roles.
You hear that? You hear that? A big party. Big party for the champ.
He got an early taste of the uncertainties of Hollywood when he made this pilot that never even aired.
Seems to me a day never went by when I was a kid that you weren't lecturing me on decency and integrity and morality.
And I'm happy to see that my lectures bore fruit.
In High School Confidential, he was typecast as a clean-cut athlete.
Hi, I'm Stig Bentley. Oh, that's too bad. I'm president of the Rangers.
And wound up in the trenches in a turn of fate.
I'm going to prove to you and through you to the entire crew that I'm not yellow.
In my book, you're still a murdering, yellow-gutted louse.
I never felt I was going to make it as an actor because to me actors were tall and handsome and with great voices.
Michael Landon in a powerful performance as the boy possessed.
In 1957, the 19-year-old finally made an impact with the campy classic, I Was a Teenage Werewolf.
When I Was a Teenage Werewolf got released, he ran in my room and he said, man, take a look at this. And I read the headline, Girls Go Ape Over Werewolf.
His ears stuck out so much that producers had to tape them back, and Landon later had them professionally fixed.
Nothing you've ever seen.
The movie, which cost less than $90,000 to make, earned nearly $7 million and helped establish the market for teenage horror flicks. He went from being a werewolf to playing an albino in God's Little Acre, and then became a soldier in The Legend of Tom Dooley. Landon was not destined to become a movie star, but he was about to find a permanent home on television. In 1959, CBS's Gunsmoke was decimating the competition when NBC decided to put on its own Western.
There was some opposition initially from the headquarters of NBC to the casting because all four of the leads were relative unknowns.
The young Cartwrights didn't look like they could be remotely related to each other, but the Bonanza audience swallowed a far-fetched story that explained everything.
Now that's impossible.
Impossible, ma'am? I don't think you'd say that if you could have seen Horse's mother.
Isn't she your mother, too?
Who, that big gal? Oh, no.
Though the boys shared the same father, they had 3 different and 3 conveniently deceased mothers. Bonanza had plenty of shoot-'em-up scenes.
Shoot him, Tumble!
And it also brought a lighter touch to TV westerns.
Say half of these rabbits happen to be mine.
You ain't skinning these rabbits, Joe.
Oh, yes, I am.
No, you ain't skinning these rabbits. Not today, you ain't, Joseph.
You're making me mad.
I'd reconsider that, little brother.
Well, I'm telling you right now. I'm telling you, I'm gonna, one way or the other, Brother Horse, I'm gonna get into one of these cages. Look, come on now, let me out of here!
During the first season, Landon knew enough about television not to get his hopes up about Bonanza.
After we sang that theme song, I thought the sets would go dark all over the world.
I've got a flair for women everywhere. Bonanza! Bonanza! Aye, aye, aye! And when I call on any gal at all, she's gonna welcome me.
Too much noise, can't sleep.
I'm not afraid of any pretty maid. Bonanza! Bonanza!
The lyrics were horrendous, and we didn't use it after. We used the music, but not the lyrics after the pilot.
Don't you turn away from me, Cartwright!
Behind the scenes, Bonanza was about to play an important role in the network's ingenious business plan. NBC's parent corporation, RCA, was trying to sell color television sets.
Color, the touchstone of reality.
I congratulate the RCA scientists, researchmen, and engineers.
My father made the decision ultimately that we should put this show on in color. Bonanza jump-started the sale of color television sets because as the show went up in the ratings, people had to see it in color.
Bonanza became a ratings juggernaut in its third season when it moved to Sunday nights. It was undoubtedly the most important show of its day and dominated the network schedule for the rest of its 14-year run.
It was one big party. I mean, here are three guys. I mean, Lauren was making a few bucks, but Dan and I, we didn't have a dime. And all of a sudden, we're going places for NBC. You can order as much food as you want.
And that was important.
I mean, we used to have breakfast you wouldn't believe. I'll have the 3 dozen oysters and the 2 steaks to start. You know, they just keep going. Room service, we couldn't believe it. And they paid us.
Landon had originally celebrated his big new job on Bonanza by going out to eat. And friends noted that Landon measured his own success by the food he could put on the table.
We were ordering dinner, and Michael ordered a platter of crab legs. He ordered another large appetizer, and then he ordered a double filet mignon. Honestly, I thought it was for everybody. And he made it very clear when I said, well, I don't think we need any other appetizers. He said, well, I don't know what you need. You know, you guys order what you want. It wasn't that he was such an enormous eater. This was his way of substantiating the fact to himself that he had made it.
Little Joe and his big brother, Haas, quickly became the show's most popular characters.
Joe, anytime you get that look in your eye, I always get in trouble.
Little Joe, of course, was a heartthrob who romanced women from one end of the Ponderosa to the other.
I want you more than anything else in the world. I want you for the rest of my life. I love you more than anything else in the world.
Oh, sure I love you. I love you like a sister.
A sister?
Landon was shrewd enough to capitalize on his newfound popularity by making lucrative personal appearances all over the country. He also managed to spend countless charitable hours with sick and disabled youngsters. He knew how to give the audience what they wanted and often appeared in his familiar Bonanza costume. Back home, the young star's marriage was in trouble. In a futile attempt to keep the marriage together, the Landons adopted a third baby named Jason. In the meantime, Landon had met a glamorous young model at the studio named Lynn No, who would become his second wife. Michael and Dodie divorced in 1961, and Dodie was awarded custody of the children. But she decided to return her third son for readoption. Baby Jason never saw either Dodie or Michael again.
Josh had been with us for a while, Jason only a year. And Mom was going through this, you know, it hurts to be left, you know. She was feeling, you know, like, you know, she couldn't concentrate on raising a kid. And Dad wasn't close enough to Jason at that point. You know, the bond hadn't happened. It wouldn't have made sense to keep him.
Michael Landon had made it to the big time, but he already wanted even more, and he knew just how to get it. When Bonanza began in 1959, Michael Landon was a 23-year-old starving actor.
Where are you?
I'm over here.
Playing childish games with brother Haas kept him laughing all the way to the bank. Having remarried, Landon was already beginning to plan his future beyond the Ponderosa.
Pa sent me to bring you home to supper.
Burn it. Dad, burn your hungry head, little brother. Dad, burn it. I reckon you think that's pretty funny, huh?
Landon's notoriously contagious laugh brought an unmistakable charm to the series.
I can't stand it. He'd laugh, and he had that wonderful giggle that no one else has. It's very distinctive.
Ain't they cute? Look at it. I told you that.
And he threw himself into the physical side of the show as well. Off-screen, Landon had fallen head over heels for his second wife, Lynn, whom he married in 1963. His co-star, Dan Blocker, was his best man at the wedding. Lynn had a daughter, Cheryl, from an earlier marriage. And the family settled into a comfortable suburban home about a half-hour's drive from the studio. The newlyweds started building their family right away. They had a daughter, Leslie, and a year later, their son Michael Landon Jr. was born. The children grew up watching their father transform into Little Joe on television.
I seen him with my own 2 eyeballs. A little man no bigger than that.
My brother, Mike, and I actually thought that my dad became very small and would climb in the back of the TV set. That's kind of how we thought about it when we were really little. And we also thought that he could see us, because when he would do live shows or parades and things, and he'd say hi to my brother and I, we would yell back, "Hi, Dad."
For this week's Hullabaloo, Little Joe of Bonanza, Michael Landon.
Landon flew to personal appearances nearly every weekend and was even an occasional guest star on network specials. In 1965, he gamely stepped on stage for the musical variety show Hullabaloo.
Come on, let me show you where it's at. Come on, let me show you where it's at. The name of the place, right here for you. The name of the place, Hullabaloo. Come on!
Landon was not a singer, and unlike the rest of his Bonanza co-stars, he had little training as an actor. He made do by putting up a tough front.
First started Bonanza. When he first started Bonanza, he was a little ornery.
I was an insecure guy. I mean, all of a sudden I was a big star, and that's tough to handle because you don't know why. So therefore, when you're insecure and you're a star and don't know why, you tend to strike out and act like you think a star should act. And if you have any brains, you outgrow it.
Morning, Little Joe.
After 6 seasons, Pernell Roberts left the show. He had reportedly always felt that Bonanza was beneath him.
Oh, you would have died of a real bad case of slow.
Landon was never content just to star in the series. He used the Bonanza set to school himself in all aspects of production.
We had a gentleman who was associate producer named John Hawkins. At lunchtime, Mike wouldn't eat lunch. He'd go up into John's office, and John would tell him to write a scene about such and such. And Mike would go out and write on the arm of the chair, because no one had a desk for him. And he'd write, take it back in. John would critique it for him, but in a nice way, not being nasty. And that went on for months.
And that was a springboard to not only his success, but also his power in the industry.
Well, don't get all out of sorts. I'm just trying to be enterprising.
He hounded producers until they let him write and direct shows.
He loved trying things with new lenses, diopters, and all these things which were new in those days. He loved this experiment. And when he started directing, you'd always have the camera crew bring in different lenses, and we'd do tests and try them out.
Brother Horst and I used to come here when we were kids.
In 1972, Dan Blocker passed away suddenly at the age of 43 from a lung clot.
Mike would have to cry in a scene, and he was asked, can you just turn on tears? And he said, yeah, I think of Dan. And what he meant to a show.
Bonanza stumbled after Blocker's death and was canceled the next season.
Bye, little brother.
By now, the Landons had welcomed a third daughter, Shauna, but they faced a crisis when a devastating car accident left their oldest daughter, Cheryl, in a coma. Landon made a pact with God that if Cheryl survived, he would make television that made a difference.
I think you can do a great deal in this world to pay back good fortune.
Bonanza had made him financially secure enough to never work again, but his bedside bargain had given Landon a renewed sense of direction, and he was about to work harder than ever before.
Whoa. Hey, where you going?
In the saloon.
Hey, Joe, I promised Paul I'd keep you out of trouble.
Trouble? Who's getting into trouble? I just got an idea to get us out of trouble. More trouble than we got out of yesterday.
The 14 years Michael Landon spent on Bonanza had made him famous as a loving son and an impish younger brother.
Oh, did I trap him? Did I trap him into a bed?
He launched Little House on the Prairie in 1974, and the long-running show made him an ideal father figure to a whole new generation of fans.
Can we give them names, Pa?
Well, sure, I think we should, seeing as they're part of the family now.
I want to call this one Patty.
Patty it is.
You better name this one Pat. He's a boy.
Laura.
Well, the child would be in a heap of trouble if she didn't know the difference between boys and girls.
Really, Charles?
Pat and Patty it is. Everybody up in the wagon.
Little House on the Prairie was based on the popular series of books by Laura Ingalls Wilder, who was played by a 9-year-old newcomer named Melissa Gilbert.
I made a special report for school, Pa, with maps and everything.
Oh, well, let's take a look at that.
He was very much like a second father to me. My own father passed away when I was 11. So without really officially announcing it, Michael really stepped in.
Landon picked Melissa to play his daughter because she was so natural and seemed like a real little girl instead of just an actress. Melissa, who had never even seen Bonanza, had no idea she was working with such a big star. She was impressed, though, with Landon for other reasons.
He would be smoking, it was real cold, and he had these big leather gloves on, and he put his cigarette out in his glove and then just, flicked the butt away, and I just thought that was... I'd never seen anything like it. That was the coolest. He was the toughest.
Landon was earning a reputation as a maverick, but a maverick with a Midas touch.
Critics didn't like Little House. They panned it. The network wasn't going to put it on the air. NBC took it to a screening house about 3 different times, and it got a higher rating than anything that they'd ever had to date.
Be back before dark. Love you.
Good luck.
Little House was a throwback to the perfect television families of the 50s and 60s. By the mid-70s, most producers thought those shows were passé. All in the Family was the top-rated hit, and the Bunkers were a dysfunctional bunch of bigots, dingbats, and meatheads. By contrast, Little House on the Prairie was a personal touchstone for all the family values Landon held dear.
I don't see how they can get closer to God than they are right here.
Michael's co-stars knew the show reflected the kind of life a lonely little boy from Collingswood, New Jersey, had always yearned for.
One of the things that Michael was always quite open about was that he had a really horrendous childhood. He was able to take what was a very negative experience and turn that into an experience that's been positive for millions of people.
Little House was also a professional milestone for Landon. Having schooled himself in television production during the Bonanza years, he was now able to take unprecedented control of his show.
Well, Ingalls family, as soon as you get done soaking your feet, we got a wagon to unload.
Landon single-handedly shouldered the workload of 4 highly demanding jobs. He performed not just as leading man, but also as writer, director, and executive producer.
I just don't feel that you can make a really terrific product if there's a large committee second-guessing each other all the time. I like input from the people I'm working with, but I don't want a whole bunch of people who really are not part of the company in the first place.
Landon kept a grueling schedule. He never needed much sleep and was usually awake at 5 in the morning to work on scripts. By 7, he was on the set, preparing the daily shooting schedule before the rest of the cast walked through the door.
I don't think there's any question that Michael had to have a large ego to be willing and able to do the things that he did. But he didn't suffer from his ego like so many people do, because he never wore it around with him. He was confident within the framework of his knowledge of what he was doing, how it would be done.
Are you happy?
Landon embraced fatherhood both on-screen and off. In 1976, Lynn gave birth to their 4th child, Christopher, making the 40-year-old star the father of 7. Having outgrown their modest suburban home, the family moved to an enormous mansion on a 7-acre estate in Beverly Hills. Landon's young co-star, Melissa Gilbert, spent weekends with the family.
The house was huge. We ran like banshees through that house, and Mike would hide behind doorways and jump out and scare us.
Hide and go seek was fun in our house because we'd have friends come over and they'd never find my brother and I because we knew all the great places to hide. It was You know, it was 15 bathrooms, and I mean, it was a big house.
On weekends, the Landon family escaped to a hideaway in Laguna Beach. Though only an hour's drive south of Los Angeles, it was a million miles away from Hollywood and the pressures of stardom.
He was wonderful at entering into a child's world. He could find that child inside of him, and I think that's what helped us bond with him so easily. And it was just so easy for him to be with us and play with us, and there was just this intimacy that we had with him.
During the week, family ground rules were strict. First off, there was no television. Though Landon had become one of the most powerful stars in television history, his own children were not allowed to watch the medium that had made him rich and famous. The only exception, of course, was Monday night and Little House on the Prairie.
Oh, I love you.
I love you too, Pa.
Landon never focused on grades, but he did encourage his children to try their best in school. He himself had never been a good student, and he made sure they didn't follow in his footsteps.
We definitely had to do our homework. My dad would check our homework, which made me nervous, especially with math, because he was very quick with numbers and I wasn't.
Landon was also trying to teach his children the value of money, which is hard enough for any parent, much less a multimillionaire whose children were growing up with servants and ponies on a 7-acre estate. The children were given chores to do around the house, and Landon was fiercely determined to keep them from turning into spoiled brats.
To teach his children that they cannot live their lives being dependent on anyone other than themselves, that they have to make their own way in life. He was a very generous person, but his children grew up thinking otherwise.
No, no more. I surrender. I can't run another step.
Me either.
Oh,
It was the best day ever, wasn't it, Pa?
oh that it was.
Creating the perfect television family came at the high cost of long hours away from his real-life home. Landon tried to compensate as best he could.
Most producers, when they decide to take a crew on location, discourage them from taking their families. But Michael was just the opposite. Michael thought of these as family adventures. You know, he'd say, hey, bring the kids, we'll have a great time.
And at the end of a long workday, and I mean a long workday, he would then go back to the motel and play with the children in the pool and throw them up in the air and find all kinds of funny things to say to them and talk about boogers and, you know, just really relate to them.
Hide and go seek, I'm it. 1, 2.
A playful man, Landon organized ball games and horseshoe contests with his young co-stars in between scenes.
I'm gonna get you.
And he targeted them for some of his outrageous pranks.
I mean, he used to drive the kids nuts because he would we'd be on location somewhere and he'd start to talk and he'd have a frog on his tongue.
He'd put frogs in his mouth. We had a script supervisor. She had this chair with these pouches on the sides, and she would carry it from set to wherever we were shooting, from spot to spot to spot throughout the course of the day. And there was one day where he was sneaking up and putting rocks in the pockets of the pouches. And the chair got heavier, and she'd be lifting the chair over, completely clueless, but of course everybody else knew.
Thanks to Landon, there were always plenty of outtakes for the gag reel.
Now there'll be milk for the children.
I don't care about the children,
Butter.
Carol. I'm fed up with the kids.
You all right?
You gotta look on the bright side. Just think what a big meal we'll have tonight when we eat that sucker. Oh, my butt. 14 years on Bonanza, it still hurts when I ride.
You're all right.
By the mid-70s, Little House on the Prairie had made Michael Landon one of the most beloved father figures on television. But the exhaustive workload was taking an increasing toll on his long-term marriage to Lynn. In 1976, the Landons discovered that 22-year-old Cheryl Lynn's oldest daughter from her first marriage, had developed a serious drug habit. Cheryl blamed the problem on painkillers she had taken to recover from a nearly fatal car accident. Landon had zero tolerance for either the abuse or the excuse.
It was a very, very tough situation, but it's a situation that, I don't know a family that doesn't have a relative somewhere along the line that's got a drug problem. At least one. It's just something you work out together, and the younger ones learn a lesson, hopefully.
The experience was enough to launch a lifelong crusade against drugs. Landon teamed up with Paul Newman's Anti-Drug Foundation, and he appeared with First Lady Nancy Reagan in support of her famously simplistic campaign, Just Say No. Landon used Little House on the Prairie as his personal soapbox.
What about the morphine that you took from Dr. Baker? Now, don't lie to me. You took it, didn't you? Didn't you? Yes!
I think Michael wanted to deliver a message in every show. Sometimes that message would be very forthright. I mean, it was dishonesty doesn't pay, or jealousy is not something that's going to enhance your life. And Michael made you feel them more than anything. Michael had a wonderful sense of getting to our emotional core.
I defy anyone to watch a Little House on the Prairie and not end up getting teary-eyed at some point. They were all so moving, and that all came from him. That all came from who he was and what he believed in, and how strongly he wanted to live that.
Mr. Ingalls?
Often, Landon himself was the one getting teary-eyed because his own emotions were so close to the surface. In this show, he cast his real-life daughter, Leslie, as a plague victim.
I wonder if I'm gonna die.
My dad got almost too emotional for the scene, and so he stopped it and had to start it again.
No more talk of dying, all right?
He had such a softness about him. It's funny because I think people often think of their mothers as being the ones that get emotional and show cry, that display crying, etc. And it was really my dad in our family.
Open up the windows and open up the doors. Let the sun shine in. Laura, you turn
Besides being the chief creative force on Little House, Landon also knew how to manage the nuts and bolts.
We both had the same philosophy. You hire somebody, you let them do their job. We also had a couple of rules that went along with that. If you want to holler and yell and carry on, you're going to be gone by the end of the day. Don't come back.
Bonanza and Little House on the Prairie had made Michael Landon a fixture in people's living rooms for nearly 2 decades. He was beloved by the audience, but roasted by critics and largely ignored by the industry.
It was not uncommon, for example, for him to get the People's Choice Awards, but not get any nominations by the Television Academy. And I think that was hard for him.
He continued to portray the ideal husband on television, but off-screen, Landon was growing apart from his real-life partner.
As a child, you don't understand the dynamics that always go on between two adults, and especially with your own parents at times. And I really had no idea, that anything was wrong.
But things at home were very wrong, and they got even worse when Michael met 18-year-old Cindy Clerico. She was working as a stand-in on the set, and Michael was quite simply thunderstruck.
Yeah, I had no clue, I had no clue whatsoever. It was my first day on the set, and he said he looked through the camera, and there was just something about your way.
Michael's initial attraction to Cindy deepened into an even stronger emotional bond, and divorce from Lynn became inevitable.
It was terrible. It was awful. It's an absolute failure when people break up.
Well, we were married for 19 years. I mean, how many people are with a company for 19 years? I mean, 19 years is a long time. And just because people grow apart at that point in their lives, it doesn't mean that everything that preceded it was a failure.
With a fortune at stake, the Landon divorce turned into a nasty legal battle. Community property laws left Lynn with a multi-million-dollar settlement.
In a sense, our world was shattered at that point.
the issues of disillusionment and anger and the fear that takes place. I just think that those are the things that I experienced.
On Valentine's Day in 1983, Michael and Cindy were married in a simple ceremony at their home in Malibu. Their first child, Jennifer, was born later that same year, and Cindy gave birth to a second child, a son named Sean. Landon's public image was undeniably bruised, but his fans ultimately would turn out to be much more forgiving than his own family.
Thank heaven you're all right. What happened?
It's over. Everybody has to be out by Sunday afternoon.
Oh, no.
After 9 long years on the network's schedule, by 1983, Little House on the Prairie had finally run its course. The children had grown into young adults, and Landon was distracted with his new NBC show, the short-lived Father Murphy, starring his good friend Merlin Olsen. When it came time to close the book on Little House on the Prairie, Michael Landon made sure it went out with a bang.
I wanted to destroy the entire town, which I did. Everybody needed a catharsis on that show. We were together for 9 years, and that's why we blew it up. That plus the fact I didn't want anybody making a trashy movie in Walnut Grove, because I liked that town.
Everybody sort of said goodbye and wandered back up to the trailers to get changed, and Mike and I were left alone, and we were both just weeping uncontrollably, sitting on a log. And he said to me, he said, "You know what, this is just the beginning for you. It's only the beginning, and it's going to be okay."
I sit down occasionally when one of these reruns comes on, and there's just something warm that happens inside of me. And I really, it makes me feel good, because I remember how much I enjoyed getting up and going to work, to be on the set with Michael.
What do you say?
I think that's downright mean. Let's do it.
Yeah, let's.
I could go home and take my kids, who were really quite young at the time, and sit down and say, this is what your father does. There aren't a lot of shows on television that I would want to do that with today.
When Little House ended, Landon hoped to focus on his directing career. He was offered many potential projects, but was reportedly off-put by the blatant sexuality and violence. Once again, he took matters into his own hands, writing and directing a semi-autobiographical movie entitled Sam's Son. For nearly a quarter century, everything Landon touched had turned to gold. But Sam's Son was a different story. It tanked in theaters and failed to launch the full-time directing career he had envisioned.
I made a feature and it did 0 in the theaters. It was a nice little movie and it did very well on television. You know, I was on 14 years on Bonanza and 9 years on Little House. I think an audience tends not to want to pay for something they get for nothing. I'm a television name, and a very important name in television. And in order to be an important name in features at this point in time in my life, I'd have to be 30 years younger, and I'm not. I'm a 50-year-old man who is not going to become a superstar at this point in his life in films.
In 1984, Landon went back to the small screen with Highway to Heaven. At first, the show didn't have a prayer with the network.
Thanks.
NBC wanted something to compete with Dallas and Dynasty, shows which epitomized the raging materialism of the 1980s. Like Little House on the Prairie, Highway to Heaven was a reminder of a simpler time.
They're beautiful.
Oh, thank you. There's nothing like some flowers to brighten up a place.
Once again, Landon was the star of the series, though by now it was his least favorite occupation.
We're gonna do another single without cheating to look up some.
Michael enjoyed directing more than anything. He liked the creativity of directing and going on the set and working with the actors, working with the crew. He really enjoyed that.
And then we'll just continue on with it, bring him up.
He liked to write, but felt it was a very lonely profession. He liked acting the least, but he was smart enough to know that the actors get the money.
Landon had grown accustomed to taking complete control. He admitted that he had trouble sharing responsibility. But within the industry, there were rumors that Landon was too controlling, somewhat inflexible, and even abrasive.
I'm not abrasive. I have no reason to be abrasive. I'm very, very secure in what I do. I'm very good at what I do. You find people that are abrasive are people who are panicky because they're trying to put up a front, pretending they know what they're doing. And this town is loaded with them.
There's plenty for all! There's plenty for all!
Ed Asner found out firsthand what Landon was like to work with.
Come on, let's go. Harold, you know how he feels about this.
What's wrong with turning a little water into wine? I mean, it was perfectly acceptable.
Now, that was for an entirely different reason, and you know it. I want you to turn it off. Come on, turn it off.
He was the man in charge, and it was the swiftest shooting in episodic television at the time, I believe, because of his expertise. You got the feeling that with this rapidity with which he shot, and with the way his crew worked and the actors responded, that there was very little opposition and that he would not brook much opposition.
I see things day in and day out, things that make me sick inside.
The moment of truth came when Asner disagreed with Landon about how to stage an important scene. He wound up finding Landon surprisingly flexible.
Why can't he let me go?
He wasn't too proud or too egotistical to accept change when he was still able to read the quality in an opposing opinion.
AB comment? Mark?
Highway to Heaven laid the groundwork for the 90s hit Touched by an Angel. But unlike that show, Landon's message was less about religion and more about just doing the right thing.
Get an ambulance.
He was not a practicing religious man in the sense of having to go to church every weekend or of making a show of being religious. But I think in his relationships with others and in the way he lived his life, I think he was a very religious man.
There, but for the grace of God, go I.
In another episode, Dick Van Dyke starred as a homeless man who was eking out an existence on street corners.
Thank you.
I found his set to be unusual. It was a family. Everybody was relaxed. I've never seen a director more relaxed than Michael. He just enjoyed himself. He obviously loved what he did.
Look, if you want booze or money, I can save you a lot of trouble. I haven't got any.
Van Dyke, of course, was legendary for his talent at comedy. But Michael Landon wrote an episode that showcased his other abilities.
Now, lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, pray the Lord my soul.
It was just easy. It just came. Yeah, Michael had big tears in his eyes. Well, he was a very emotional man. Michael was very emotional and sensitive. I like the way he wrote it. He's not... The whole television industry is so afraid to put any spirituality in a show, any mention of it. I don't know, it's not hip or something. And the character I played, just before he died, said he saw God. Nobody but Michael would have the nerve to do that.
And you know, because you touched the face of God.
And so will you tonight.
Michael knew how to touch people's hearts, and he really did. I'm always taken back to the Frank Capra movies of the 30s and 40s. You walked out of the theater feeling good about yourself. You had a good feeling. And always, it did something for people. And Michael's television shows did that. After you watched them, you kind of felt good about yourself, and life looked a little brighter. And what else is entertainment for but that?
Highway to Heaven was a bona fide hit, but Landon was after something more. He was about to do something everyone else said would never work on television.
I bet you're wondering who I am and what I'm doing here. You're wondering that, aren't you? Well, I've been elected by the birds of Rose Beach to be their spokesman.
After nearly a quarter century on television, Michael Landon definitely knew how to get people's attention.
Because they're dead.
By the mid-'80s, Landon was using his third primetime hit, Highway to Heaven, to campaign for the causes and the people he believed in.
You can only make the kind of show that that you really feel you want to make, that in my case I feel is needed. I think it's important that people think a little bit. If they're not going to at least read, if they're going to sit there and watch this thing until they vegetate, at least let them think a little bit. It might force them to pick up a book.
All right, you kids ready for camp?
One of Highway to Heaven's most memorable stories focused on a summer camp for cancer patients.
Look, I'll make you a deal. You take off your hat and I'll take off my leg. What do you say?
Okay.
Camp is so wonderful. It allows these children to be with a bunch of other kids, first of all, that understand what cancer is. So they get to be regular kids. Nobody gives a damn if you're bald-headed because you've been on chemotherapy, because there's a bunch of bald heads around here.
Make sure you're concentrating on the song and don't look at the camera, because that'll give it away. You gotta pretend that camera's not there. Who I noticed as the camera went by went...
The inspirational story was based on a real-life camp for desperately ill children.
And even louder. Go!
The whole idea was to help kids forget about cancer for a while, and Michael Landon was head cheerleader.
You're not going to find these kids depressing. You may feel a little guilty about what you've been bitching about over the last year or so, but...
I don't think that the stories we did about cancer really, there was no inner thoughts, there was no feeling that, oh, maybe someday I'll be sick or something. I think it was just that he had met a lot of people and had known a lot of people who had been ill with this disease.
Say, may I have 8 hamburgers, please?
Some of the children who appeared in the show were actual cancer patients, and without any fanfare or the usual Hollywood publicity, Michael Landon did something wonderfully unexpected.
He was amazing. He could have left every day, and instead he stayed and had dinner with the kids, and he signed autographs, and he sat around the campfire, and he was just one of the counselors. He was terrific. This went on for a whole week.
As we start down here, loosen to what you have to do to hold the tight.
Disabled children were close to Landon's heart. Another episode of Highway to Heaven focused on the Special Olympics.
Hey, nice jump. They just want to be part of us. They want to be part of this world and given a chance to live like we do. And they can.
All right!
Already impossibly rich and internationally famous, Landon raised the bar with which he measured his own success. Now he was focusing on how many people he could help. Landon hired quadriplegic Jim Troche, who wrote and starred in an episode that included one of Landon's personal trademarks, tough love.
What's the matter? You scared?
Me?
Yeah, you.
Tom Sullivan, who was blind since birth, wrote 3 episodes of Highway to Heaven.
You sat me down there on purpose, didn't you?
I didn't think you'd notice.
I told you. Don't try to pull a fast one on a blind guy.
He was willing to stretch the envelope and do it with humor in a way that made us all figure if he thought we were that good, we were.
Hey, that wasn't too bright.
Watch where you're going.
I certainly wish I could.
Sullivan never wanted and never got any special treatment from Michael Landon.
You rappelled down that cliff and you can't see?
The only way I'd rappel down a sheer face like that. Wouldn't take a chance if I was sighted. It's much too scary.
He kept saying we had to climb up the cliff, and it was real rock climbing. And somebody had said to him, "Do you think we ought to have a stunt guy do this for Tom, or do you think we ought to get a crane in here and put Tom up there, or do you whatever they said?" And he said, I'll never forget the line. He said, "No, it's great that he's blind because he's the only guy that doesn't have to worry about looking down."
25, take one. Just started.
During the second year of Highway to Heaven, Landon's son, Mike Jr., asked his father for a job. He had no training or experience in production.
I had the opportunity to be an assistant cameraman on his show for 5 years. He was by far the best boss in this business.
Up until that point, Mike Jr. had been adrift. He later admitted dabbling with drugs as a teenager, flunking out of college, and working in a restaurant as a busboy. Whatever difficulties, Mike Sr. let his children make mistakes, but was there when they needed him.
You don't have to teach them to fail. They're going to manage that one. Just teach them not to be afraid of it, because it's not horrendous. It isn't bad. Most people are, I think, injured more by success than they ever are by failure.
Help me, doctor, please!
Part of his past came back to haunt Landon when he decided to resurrect the campy cult film I Was a Teenage Werewolf for a dream sequence he directed on Highway to Heaven.
We're going to dump this wall. Okay. We're going to start here. Well, come on, whose idea do you think it was?
Oh, tell us.
I mean, I was the teenage werewolf. I am now a middle-aged werewolf. Of course it was my idea. Okay, I like some pork and steak tartare, and you guys can go to lunch, too.
Another part of Landon's past was catching up with him. It had been 2 decades since he had played Little Joe Cartwright. Now his son was getting a shot at a Bonanza revival.
He wants to be behind the camera, but all of a sudden he has the opportunity to be in front of the camera, and they're making a new Bonanza series for syndication, and he's going to play my son in that show, which absolutely flips me out. I mean, I think it's fabulous.
But when the second generation failed to recapture the old Bonanza magic, the series rode off into the proverbial sunset. Landon's youngest daughter, Jennifer, always wanted to be an actress, and he cast her in one of his final episodes of Highway to Heaven.
Merry Christmas, great-great-great-grandfather.
She had one line in the show. Her line was, "Merry Christmas, great-great-great-great-great-grandfather."
There's a really big saga about how many greats there was going to be when I said Merry Christmas.
She did the scene. Now that night, we have a little memo pad on the refrigerator down at the end of the pantry that also has a little recorder on it, so you can push the button in and leave a very short message. She was down, I could hear her talking down there. So she was down at the end of the pantry, and she was saying her line into this little tiny recorder and playing it back. So then she saw me looking at her. I said, "Honey, what are you doing?" She said, "Dad," now this is a 5-year-old, where she gets at, "is there any possibility that I could loop that line?" She said, "I'm doing it much better here in the pantry." I mean, I couldn't believe it.
All he would do was talk about the kids. And he knew exactly what every one of his 9 children were doing. He goes, "Oh, it's 8 o'clock. Jennifer's in a ballet recital." We ended up going to the market, and he said, "Did I tell you that my son Mark got a job in the mornings working in the market?" That's all he knew about. He knew everything each of his kids were doing. He was just unbelievable when it came to the kids.
I have wonderful children.
He likes it.
I've got my priorities straight. That working is not the most important thing in my life.
Your chick has turned itself and is pipping away at the large end of the egg.
In 1990, Art Carney starred in Landon's last TV movie, Where Pigeons Go to Die.
I tell you what inspired me. 2 words. Michael Landon.
When you're connected with something with Michael Landon's name on it, you got a class act.
Landon named a character in the story after his business manager.
I'm Dennis Korn from Jason Realty. Mr. Jason just called me on the car phone. He's stuck at a deposition. He's running a little late.
He wanted to find a tall, dorky-looking guy to play my part, and he kept sending me pictures of the weirdest-looking people, say, this is going to play your part. That was Michael.
Turn on the water.
He believed in people, and at the time, series were shooting for maybe $1.1 million, $1.2 million, somewhere in that range. And Michael, because the crew was so committed, would bring the shows in for maybe $800,000 or whatever it was. Well, his deal was that obviously the money belonged to him. It was paid by the networks and it went to the production companies. What nobody knew was that he was putting that money aside, and whenever there wasn't a Landon series on the air, principal crew people still got paid. I mean, he carried them. He never wanted to lose them.
He took care of the crew. He took care of everybody. I'd be shooting me at the last shot of the day, and I'm sitting there on the dolly and feel something slide in my pocket. And, of course, go home, get ready to get a shower. Here's that envelope. Now open it up. A check, $5,000, $10,000.
Away from work, Landon enjoyed pushing the envelope.
I guarantee you this helmet's never seen this much air.
He couldn't wait to be buckled into the back seat with the Blue Angels, the Navy's team of precision pilots.
Oh, it was absolutely unbelievable. I mean, it was gorgeous. I mean, you just touch that plane and shoot, it goes.
The Blue Angels managed to bring out the daredevil in Landon, but then again, that wasn't too hard to do.
He was afraid of nothing. He was absolutely fearless. We took off in a helicopter once in Denver, Colorado, to go back to get a plane back to Los Angeles. We'd made some kind of appearance. And the pilot said, whoops, and there was lightning all around us. And sitting in the back seat of the helicopter, I had moments of some worry. And he said, no, over here. I said, what are you, nuts? And the pilot said, oh, we can't go into it. He said, no, I want to get closer to the lightning.
A true thrill seeker, Michael Landon had wound up cheating death many times over. His luck, though, was about to run out.
I think all of us create our own miracles.
On April 8, 1991, Michael Landon called a press conference to announce the shocking news that he had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. Landon was essentially announcing his own death sentence, but he handled it the way he had managed most of his life, head on.
It was that way from day one, and that's why Michael had called a press conference telling everybody what he had, so there would not be any speculation and stories and all of that. He just sort of wanted to lay it out on the line from day one.
I think every moment just gets a little more important after something like this.
He called us at the house, and he said, Michael has something. Whew. Sorry. Cindy said, Michael's got something to tell you that's not good. No, I'm okay. I cried then, I'm crying now. Because it wasn't good. He meant an awful lot to a lot of people. And there'll never be another one like him. Never. He was genuine. He cared for people. The sweetest man I ever know.
Things that you probably wouldn't notice become important.
Word of Landon's illness ricocheted around the world, and before long, the post office was deluged with stacks of mail, thousands of letters a week. No one was more surprised than Michael himself.
Michael never looked at himself as a star, as a big star. And I know that this house was filled with boxes of letters and books And I remember we were sitting there one day reading, he was looking through some of the letters, and I think he was very touched by the fact that he had felt that he had actually had and made a difference in the lives of some people because of his shows. That meant a lot to him.
For the past month, he has continued to face this battle with humor and honesty and a personal sense of dignity that characterizes the man. Would you welcome Michael Landon?
Some of the letters were sympathetic, and some suggested the most far-out therapies imaginable. Landon chose to talk about one of his favorites during his final appearance on The Tonight Show, which became one of the highest-rated Tonight Shows of all time.
The one guy wrote me, he told me that the reason you got it, you got the big C, was that I did not get enough sex. See, he thinks it was only the 9 times when I had the kid.
Michael had been a guest of The Tonight Show many times, and in private, he and Johnny Carson were close personal friends. But this visit was clearly different for Landon. This time, he had something he wanted to get off his chest about the tabloid press.
It seems so totally insensitive to me, especially since, how do they know what my little kids have been told in my own home, that a tabloid would write 4 weeks left, or it's over. Can you imagine that?
Well, the tabloids have never been
can you imagine?
known for their decency or sensitivity.
I mean, it's unbelievable that people can be that way. That's a cancer.
Jennifer told me just a couple weeks ago that after we said Dad had cancer, she said, you know, Mom, I went in my room and cried, never said anything because I knew Dad probably wasn't going to make it. So we wanted to protect her, but we also wanted not to have them think that Dad was going to be alive if there was a possibility. He wasn't. We wanted to be very honest with him.
I remember, like, he would explain it to us in terms that we could understand, especially from my brother, because he was so little. He was really young. And, like, my brother said that he wished that my dad was a crab so that he could cut through the clouds and come back down.
Landon had been feeling ill for quite some time. In retrospect, his daughter Leslie realized that something was seriously wrong at her wedding just a few months earlier.
Now that I look back, and he was probably sick at that time with pancreatic cancer, it was probably one of my most wonderful days in my life was my wedding day with my whole family, and it was a magical day for me. Yeah, I feel very lucky that way because I know I have younger siblings. Sorry. I'm just thinking of Jennifer. You know, I was just thinking, you know, she won't have that experience. She wouldn't have my dad doing that with her.
How you doing?
Landon's life was becoming completely chaotic. Every move he made, reporters and photographers were waiting. Publicly, Landon had always said he would fight cancer until the very end. Some of his closest friends knew otherwise.
You know, I was a little worried about this interview tonight. You've made me feel much better. With your attitude.
Michael Landon's appearance on The Tonight Show with his good friend Johnny Carson was surprisingly uplifting. Though facing the bleakest of futures, Landon found humor in the worst situations.
I asked before I went if there was anything that he wanted, and they told me that all he really cared about doing at that point was laughing, which was very important to him. I spent, 10 years basically crawling around on the ground laughing with tears streaming down my face because of him. It was very hard to see this man who, was this big, tough guy who put cigarettes out in his hand, who to me always looked like an upside-down triangle. He was so built and so strong, and he never wore a shirt, and he was just this vital, solid guy, and he was so sick and so gray in his skin and so weak, and it wasn't him.
Landon was undergoing conventional treatment while also experimenting with alternative therapies.
Oh, coffee enemas.
Coffee in a...
Oh, I take coffee enemas. Anybody out there ever heard of a coffee enema?
Yes, I've heard of it.
Oh, you must be fun to have breakfast with.
Yes.
He was starting to feel better when doctors gave Landon the sobering news that the cancerous growth had actually doubled in size. That's when he decided to pull the plug on his aggressive medical treatments.
We did have a couple of discussions about this, about the medicine, and I still feel myself that there is medicine available, and so did Cindy, and he felt that common medical knowledge at the time had more or less consigned him to the scrap heap he was about to be through, and so he wanted to give up and let everybody get on with their lives, and that was frustrating.
I think he began to realize that he then had a choice of how much pain he was going to be in and how much he would be able to enjoy his family during the last time. And family was such an important part of his life that his choice was very simple. He said, I want to be able to spend some time with my kids and with my wife. You know, he didn't want to spend that time dazed and not able to really communicate. So the end result was that he really probably suffered quite a bit in the last part of his life.
I thought to myself, this is not very good. And he knew it. We all knew it. But, you know, there's always this feeling in your heart that when you love somebody, it's going to be all right. And somehow, because he was invincible to us, he could do anything. He would do anything. He'd chance anything. He'd go anywhere. So you never felt that anything was going to happen to him. But we were wrong.
Once the press got wind that the end was near, a ghoulish death watch began outside the Landon compound. Landon passed away quietly on July 1st, 1991, at the age of 54.
It was terrifying to think that the privacy of someone who was ill and who had died, and the family who had just experienced it, was experiencing a war zone.
I looked out the window and a helicopter is circling overhead and just trying to shoot down, and people were lined up on the street. I called a friend I knew at the sheriff's department, and they had just a regular van from the undertaker. And we took down a part of a fence and they backed it in and under a porch so that we could get him out without anybody seeing him.
My husband did the best he could to make sure that it was not caught on tape. Unfortunately, in the moment, Cindy was very upset and very emotional and ran after the van as it was leaving, and they caught it. And of course, at the time, she didn't know, and it was probably the furthest thing from her mind, but it was terrible. It was terrible.
Landon had meant to make a videotape to say goodbye to each of his children, but he became too weak too fast. But he had composed a letter for his wife, Cindy.
It was on Mother's Day, and it was his wishes for me about my life, basically, you know, and hoping that he would be here 5-10 years from now, that we could sit and read this together. But it was basically him telling me, these are things that I feel and things that I wish for you when I'm not here.
One person who chose not to visit Landon during his final days was his second wife, Lynn, to whom he had been married for 19 years. Lynn told her children that their divorce had already been like a death to her. And when death eventually claimed Michael Landon, Lynn was one of the few who chose not to attend his memorial.
It was a day of tremendous emotion and ups and downs, and of sharing favorite stories, of talking about the difference that Michael had made in our lives.
If there was a message Michael had for his friends and family, they knew it was best expressed in a line he wrote for Little House on the Prairie, which was read by actress Patricia Neal.
Remember me with smiles and laughter, for that's how I'll remember you all. If you can only remember me with tears, then don't remember me at all.
Michael Landon passed away a mere 3 months after being diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. He was only 54 years old. In many ways, Landon's death served to unify the family he had left behind, but it also caused significant splinters in the Landon family tree. The immediate issue was Landon's multi-million-dollar estate. Who got what? Some children went public with complaints. Others hired independent auditors to review Landon's financial records.
The estate plan didn't satisfy everyone. When you have as many beneficiaries, children in this case, as Michael, you're bound to have different interpretations of what is right and what isn't. Certainly by my standards, and I would think by most people's standards, he left each of his children wealthy.
The Landon family feud had become a tabloid staple, and after his death, there was a morbid curiosity about his rich young widow, Cindy Landon. For several years after her husband's death, tabloid photographers followed her every step.
Boy, yes, there was a lot of effort for some reason to scandalize her. Independent photographers and writers would try and find something to sell their story to the various tabloids. So they literally followed her in cars whenever she went out to a restaurant. There'd be a couple of cars of photographers parking right behind her. I mean,
Cindy finally moved her 2 children to the south of France for a year to escape all the public scrutiny. But within a decade, Michael Landon's name was back in the public spotlight, and some say being dragged through the mud. In the spring of 1999, Michael Landon Jr. unveiled an unflattering portrait of his father in a highly rated television movie.
Mike and I spoke about the movie. He told me what he was doing, and he felt that this was something that he needed to do. And basically, it was something that he thought he could do for his career.
The movie focused on Landon's divorce from his second wife, Lynn, and marriage to his third wife, Cindy. Landon was portrayed as a selfish and callous man. TV Guide even wondered whether the portrayal should be called Daddy Dearest. Michael Landon Jr. wrote and directed the story.
At least I hope that it's a very balanced, very truthful story.
I believe television has a right to do whatever they want in terms of fiction. That's what television's about. I don't think it's fair to fictionalize real life.
Action!
It's always easy to say there's a dark side after somebody's dead because you can't fight back. I doubt very much if anybody would want to say that if he was alive.
Mike Jr. traded on his father's name in order to jumpstart a career as a director. But his version of events struck many family friends as wildly inaccurate. And privately, they were heartsick that Mike Jr. had tarnished his father's reputation. Landon himself had never claimed to be a saint.
Be good to each other and don't judge each other. We've all got our problems.
Thanks to 3 decades on television, exemplifying strong, idealistic characters, Landon had always been held to a higher standard. He had come a long way from the lonely, miserable childhood he had endured as a scrawny little boy named Eugene Horowitz. He had invented a new name and a new life for himself as a handsome young star called Michael Landon. Then he took that name and turned it into a brand name, making it synonymous with wholesome family entertainment. Along the way, he strove to create the loving family he had always wanted.
His mother was physically abusive with him and very emotionally abusive. I think he's still hurt about some of those things that happened in his past because they were quite painful. When his mother died, I think he had a sense of relief at that time, but I think there was also still that sense of loss, you know, of things that could have been different.
But somewhere in the process, he basically said, what matters is family, what matters is relationship, what matters is people connecting.
It always amazes me how people who are so lonely, so devoid of love in their lives, still consider themselves successful.
Mike was the kind of guy that if you met him for the first time, he would impress you because he had such an energy around him. People talk about auras. I don't know that I believe in that or not, but I know around Michael there was such an energy that everybody that met him was captivated. Little kids that
He loved kids. He thought they were so honest and genuine and just so he could be who he was, and he didn't have to be, people weren't looking at him like, this movie star. They were more honest with him, more real.
I remember Michael as being the happiest, craziest. I never saw anybody with such a quick wit in my life. It didn't matter what you were talking about, he had a joke for it.
We got in a card game, AC-doocy, and all Michael wanted to be sure of is Jay left the airplane with no money. And Jay was Michael's business manager, so when we took all of Jay's money, Michael stopped the game so Jay could not earn the money back. When we arrive at the hotel, Michael tells the bellman, take all the luggage to Jay Eller's room. Jay had already gone up to his room, and the bellman says, fine. So Michael and I hide in the hallway, and we're behind a door, and all the luggage is delivered to Jay's room. He doesn't have a dime to tip the guy. He's embarrassed like you would not believe. And the bellman leaves. Michael and I come out from behind the door. Michael gives the bellman an unbelievable tip. And he says to him, do me a favor, go back to the man's room and complain. And so the bellman knocks on Jay's door. Jay's already embarrassed, and the bellman says, anybody can afford to stay in a fancy hotel like this can afford a tip. And Jay is bright red and completely embarrassed. And Michael was just cracking up, and he kept telling everybody, that's my business manager. That's the guy who handles my investments.
Every time I call my son Michael, I can kind of hear him laugh. Probably thinking, you named him after me? What, are you nuts? Couldn't you have named him after Winston Churchill or somebody who did something really good?
It's like, don't take life so seriously. Take your tasks, your work seriously. Don't take yourself so seriously. He was really into that. Don't get hung up on yourself. One of his theme songs.
Michael was a pragmatist. He knew that the minute they told him that was the final sentence, he indulged the rest of us by following through and with some pursuit of alternative remedies. But in his heart, as well as his mind, he knew that the responsible doctors that told him he had 2 months to live, without equivocation, would not have told him that if it wasn't true. So the rest of the motions that he went through, and he did go through them, he tried, but they were for the rest of us,
I just remember, I remember there was one distinct moment though when my brother was helping my dad up the back staircase, and he was carrying my dad's oxygen tank, and watching them both go up the back stairs. That moment for me was a release of, it was a lot of release of emotions, but I realized at that point that he really was going to die, and that I needed to let that be okay, because I could tell he was suffering, and that was not the quality of life that he wanted for himself. He was ready to go.
There's a whole new generation of young people growing up with Little House out there, and I think they love it as much as the last generation did, and I hope that goes on and on and on, because it's one of the very special legacies that Michael has left to us.
He set a standard that I would like to have seen the rest of the television industry follow for family entertainment.
He hates the word sweet or saccharine, but if it reaches the heart, it plays.
Live every minute, guys.
Melissa Gilbert and husband Bruce Boxleitner consider their child a miracle. He was born 12 weeks premature, weighed 3 pounds, and spent his first 6 weeks in a hospital. When it came to naming the baby, Melissa called him Michael, after another fighter who had meant so much to her. Melissa and many others remain upset by the television movie directed by Michael Landon Jr. The younger Landon was widely accused of making a profit while destroying his father's image and reputation.
For the web's best bios, log on to our website at biography.com.